Alright, I don't think I have anything to apologize for this week, knock on wood. I'm pretty sure the audio is okay, and of course I'm still learning, but Daniel's audio is probably functional to the point where you guys can listen to it this week. That is my hope. So, we're returning. You just hopefully listened to the episode on meta ethics. Now, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, Daniel and I, you know what we got for you? An episode on normative ethics. So, Daniel and I were discussing what is good, actually, and after determining what is good, you need to pick what ethical theory you can use and employ in your everyday life to actually get there. Because last week we got to good, but now how are you going to employ changes in your life to become that better person? So the biggest talking point of this episode was the golden rule, and Daniel talked about the simplicity of it and how that's a good thing and a bad thing. He also talked about Gensler's Kita stipulation on the golden rule, and that is K-I-T-A, and he'll explain that. So the second talking point for the episode was consequentialism and non-consequentialism, and I'm not going to explain those now. I'll let the big man do his work, but he also focused in on a pluralistic goods-based model. So that doesn't mean anything to you now, or it might. You may know more about philosophy than I do. I'm just assuming. At the end of the episode, though, you should know what it means, and that is the goal. I hope you guys are ready for episode 2. Daniel and I talked for an hour and 40 minutes, family. So this is coming out in 3 parts, and I'm not sorry about it. Catch you later. All right, so it's been not very long since Daniel and I recorded the meta ethics episode, but this is all happening before the season comes out, so this is really irrelevant information to you. But we're back again, me and my friend Daniel Zamoyski, and last time we were discussing meta ethics and the nature of good and how we get to good, and now I'm going to let Daniel explain what the objective is for this episode and how we're going to get through it together. So, Daniel, how's it going, and what's our mission today, my friend?
Hello, Keaton. Glad to be on again. Glad to be here and talking to you guys about nerdy stuff for yet another time. I'm doing pretty well. It's been a long week for me because of studying and because of finals. But definitely glad to put forward time into this podcast and into this episode. So last time we were talking a little bit about meta ethics, about the foundational stuff that obviously is really, really important for trying to become a more moral person, trying to get to good. We talked about like what kind of ways do we actually get there, what kind of approaches we can take, why I think a more philosophically sound approach is important, but why I also think it really comes down to simplicity and really comes down to consistency at its core. Right. And today we're going to be talking and delving a bit more into the normative ethics side of things. So we're not really talking about how we should be thinking and how we should be getting to good, but really just what is good actually, and what kind of ethical theories should we use to guide us. Normative ethics isn't, or at least normative ethical theory, which is specifically the thing we're discussing, isn't the same thing as what you may have heard of as applied ethics. It's not the same thing as discussing, whether this is good or this is bad, and that's not really the point of this episode. Really, what I want listeners, what I want you, Keaton, and myself really to have is just a foundation for actually deciding on those applied issues. Right. Like, for example, whether you should be nice to your neighbor or not, or whether you should have a bunch of children or not, etc., etc.
So, tell me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that while we aren't specifically deciphering if X is a good action or X is a bad action, what we're really inspecting is how can we act in accordance of the rational and consistent and logic behaviors that you outlined last time and employ that in our everyday lives to act ethically, right?
Yes, basically. Basically, it's what framework, what theory, or what way of thinking actually does meet what we discussed earlier. It's basically what should we follow. Kind of that's the kind of the goal of normative ethical theory.
Right.
And what's going to end up happening? There's going to be one approach that you like more, or that I like more. And I believe that, again, in the vast majority of situations, whether, I'll just throw around terms, whether you're a Rossian pluralist or you're a Sidgwickian utilitarian, or you're like David, whatever David Hume was, or whatever, it doesn't matter. I feel like for most situations, it's going to end up being the same thing, where, you're going to agree on good pretty often. I just think people, could just be better at getting to that baseline level even. Okay.
I honestly would just say that it's really interesting that everybody comes into this portion of their lives at a different time, right?
Right.
How old are you right now?
19.
You're 19.
Almost 20.
I'm turning 22 in June. And while you started out of a passion and I started because I took a course, I think it's really interesting that we're both even a couple years apart, and we're still looking for ways how to better our action, how to act in accordance of ethical theories that we can circumscribe to. And I think the best part is, even in the last episode, you're a very big supporter of intuitionism, and I'm a very big supporter of prescriptivism, but that doesn't mean that we could not get along on the same moral sense or the same ethical stance. So I'm very much excited to get into this.
Yeah. It very much is like just a learning journey. I feel like my opinions, my approaches are gonna be so different in 10 years. I'll just know so much more. But I think that's also one of the nice, or one of the cool things about morality. Some people actually get really upset by this, but I personally think it's really cool. It's like how it evolves with you, how it's so dependent on your knowledge, and how it's in a sense kind of subjective, but at the same time it kind of feels alive almost.
Right.
If that makes sense.
No, it does.
All right, so to delve into like the most basic, the most common form of normative ethics out there, or just a normative base, is I think you've heard of this one, the Golden Rule. So for those not familiar, the Golden Rule is basically really common phrase: do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Basically, it's taking moralities, distilling this into one sentence, and it says, you don't want to be hurt. You want a good life. Well, you should want that for others realistically, and you should act in that way. I think the Golden Rule is particularly powerful. It's also particularly common. There's a version of the Golden Rule in most religious texts. The Golden Rule is something that you see taught and you see everywhere. It's a phrase and a term that most people are familiar with. If I just went around saying Golden Rule to like people on the street around the world, not everyone would recognize it. But if I just said the basic quote in whatever language, I think most people would recognize that trait and be familiar with it. You can develop Golden Rule further, and this is what Harry Gensler does, which was the textbook author of the textbook of the class we took. And again, Harry Gensler, what he does is he takes the Golden Rule and makes it more philosophically sound, makes it more consistent with itself, and make sure that it works in like edge cases that you might immediately think of. But yeah, tell me, Keenan, what do you think about the Golden Rule? When I tell you, do unto others as you would unto you, do you feel like this is already like getting to what we want to get? Do you feel like this is already pretty good?
I think, based on the stance that I took last time, I really do think it's important to have freedom in an ethical theory. And I think it's important to be able to take the weight of your decisions on yourself under your ethical framework. So with that in mind, like, the Golden Rule fits perfectly, because it's like, if I want everybody to be treated with respect, then I got to do the same for everybody else. And honestly, I think the beauty of the golden rule at face value is that it's so simple, but it teaches you so much. And I think regardless of who you are, you're going to be able to employ it in different ways. So I think it's a good option, but I also think that it could be used in not the wrong way, but it could be interpreted in a way that I wouldn't agree with, because it's like, if I believe that stealing is wrong wholeheartedly, but somebody to the left of me decides that it's not wrong and that they're going to steal from stores because they feel like it, and they also own a store, so that they don't ever call the police when other people steal from their store, it's like, you're entitled to that opinion, but fundamentally I disagree. So I think there are some ways where it can be strengthened, but I'll allow you to get into that.
I mean, I think that's pretty interesting, though. A consistent thief, a logically consistent thief. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna steal. I think that's good, but also, you can steal from me, because if I was in the same situation, I'd want to do that. I don't think you're gonna meet a lot of these personally.
No.
But it is an interesting situation to think about. So for the golden rule, one I don't know that word. Ignore that. One criticism that often comes up, oft repeated, is that something you can say?
Sure,
I'm not sure. I don't know English. One thing that often comes up is, the golden rule is just so simple. The golden rule the golden rule has a lot of flaws in how you logically apply it to every single possible situation, which is also, a common criticism of every single ethical theory that has ever existed. One thing that ends up happening, once you think about it a little bit more, is that the golden rule doesn't actually, tell you what to do in a lot of situations. Like when you said with your example of, the logically consistent thief, the thief that thinks stealing is good, and if he owned a store, he would also support stealing and people stealing from him. It doesn't actually tell you, what you should wish upon others. And people are gonna, diverge in their ideologies and what they find desirable for themselves, genuinely for themselves, and for what they think other people should desire. So there's still, if everyone adopts this golden rule theory, there's still going to be disagreements.
Right.
But here's why I think, and I really agree with Gensler here, here's why I think that the golden rule is actually, a little better than it might seem at first glance. So the first thing that comes up is, again, this oft repeated criticism. It's basically, all right, let's say, do unto others as you want others to do unto you. Well, let's say, let's say I'm talking to a guy about, say he needs to clean the bathroom, right? Let's say I'm talking to my brother. My brother needs to clean the bathroom. And, I'm really busy. I can't take care of this. My brother needs to take care of this. He's being a little lazy. And if I was in my situation, if I was in, the person A's situation, where it's I have this lazy brother, I'd probably tell him. I'd probably think it's morally right to tell him that, I'm a little bit busy. We need to set this boundary. But let's say my brother is a little deaf. And he can't hear me. Well, if I was my brother and I didn't hear something, I just want them to repeat it to me a little bit louder, because, if I can hear it, I'm probably just distracted on my phone or something. So I look at my brother and I notice he didn't hear me, and I think to myself, oh my God, well, I want people to act as unto them and as they would want unto me, etc., etc. So I'm just gonna repeat myself a little bit louder, and eventually I'm yelling at my brother, which is what I would want for myself if I need to get something done. But my brother's deaf, and I'm imagining the wrong type of person in his situation. I'm imagining, if I was my brother, what would I want? But really, that's not the case. It's if I was my brother who is deaf, what would I want? So that's the most common criticism that comes up, is the golden rule isn't exactly what the other person wants, but more importantly, the golden rule isn't, what you would want exactly in that other person's shoes. So that's what Gensler talks about in his textbook, and that's why Gensler introduces a condition to the golden rule, which is basically, if I were in the same situation as them, same, condition, same age, same state, same species, etc., although he doesn't talk about that, would I want that? And, I have to imagine myself not just being my brother, I have to imagine myself being my deaf brother. So then it becomes not yell at him or repeat yourself more loudly. You take into account the fact that he's deaf, and you tap him on the shoulder.
Right.
And that's applying the golden rule in a more philosophically sound way. And, the criticism becomes, golden rule simplistic if, it's about what you want, but you can actually add that philosophically sound step that it's situational, that you have to actually adopt the other person's characteristics, and that deals with a lot of these hypotheticals that are like really dumb, like the case of the deaf brother.
I would say the first thing is that, would you attest that the stipulation that Gensler gave was to avoid us projecting our wants through the golden rule? Because the way you explain that case to me is saying that as a hearing person, if I don't hear somebody, I want them to repeat themselves at a higher octave or a louder volume so I can hear them. But as a deaf person, it's like, well...
Tap them on the shoulder. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very different thing. Yeah.
So I think that's very important, and I think it ties into the point that I had earlier, is that regardless of the simplicity of this, the golden rule requires logic, it requires intuitive thinking, and it requires compassion to be employed, in my earnest opinion, which is why I think it's such a compelling argument for normative ethics.
Exactly. Especially Gensler's form of golden rule. So one way that one criteria that he thinks that you need to do every single time you apply the golden rule, I believe this was mentioned in the last episode, if it wasn't, it's fine, is what he calls KITA, or KITA. Firstly, you need to be knowledgeable about the situation. So in the case of the deaf brother, you need to know that your brother is deaf, because otherwise you can't tap him on the shoulder. And if you don't know, that's fine. But you can't really act in the ideal way, which is tapping him on the shoulder, if you don't know. The second one is imagination. And with imagination, it requires the fact that, he is deaf. That means he can't hear. That means you have to imagine the fact that he can't hear, which means you have to imagine the fact that talking louder won't actually, help him. Just kind of obvious in the situation of the deaf brother. But I'm sure you can imagine a situation where it wouldn't be as obvious. People don't imagine, the effect, the impact of their actions pretty often, I believe. Right. Both with regards to themselves and with regards to other people. And with KITA, it's also the T part is you have to test. So the test part is he's referring to consistency. So now that you know and you've imagined, the test is, put yourself in another person's shoes. If you were your deaf brother, you knew you were deaf, you imagined it fully, would you be willing to be tapped on the shoulder, or would you be willing to get yelled at? What would be more effective? So once you're imagining, the T part is you're testing for whether you would want that to happen to you, assuming, of course, that you are in the situation of the other person. It's not just you, it's a hypothetical version of you, where, again, you are the deaf brother. And then the A part is, of course, apply or act, is you only act using the golden rule criteria. So KITA, KITA, know, imagine, test, act. Know what is the situation on the ground, the facts on the ground. Imagine or empathize. This is why people say empathy is important. Then test, make sure you're consistent, and then act. So another criticism of the golden rule that does come up is that the golden rule is that what the other person wants. Sorry, we already discussed about the golden rule being what you want with the imagination criteria. But it's also not what the other person wants. Like, I believe I used this example in the last episode. Like, if you have a dog, and it likes sweets, and then there's a nice pool of really sweet tasting antifreeze on the ground, you really probably wouldn't want the dog to drink it, or to lick it or whatever. And any person that doesn't actively hate dogs.
911, what's your emergency?
I think somebody broke into my house. He's in my living room.
Okay, stay where you are. We're going to send someone over right now.
Hang on, I'm gonna investigate.
You do not have to do that.
Oh, this ain't no man, it's a dog, and I hate dogs.
Would probably, pull the dog away from the antifreeze. But, the dog is thinking, I like sweet things. This looks sweet. This blue colored. It looks pretty cool. Why shouldn't the dog lick it? Because that's what the dog wants, because it smells sweet. So you have to introduce this additional criteria, which is that you're imagining yourself to be the other person, let's say the deaf brother or the dog, and you're imagining it as if you're in their situation with their wants, their desires, their needs, etc. But you're using your you're using your rational knowledge outside of that as well. The phrasing that Gensler uses is, am I willing that if I were in the same situation, that this be done to me? So he uses that little phrase, am I willing that if, which I think is a little bit wordy, and I'm not going to overly explain it. But he does use this situation, this phrase, am I willing that if, to account for this fact. Let's say you're the person that's looking at the dog. You're thinking, well, yes, of course the dog wants the sweet antifreeze. And if I were in the dog situation, I would want something sweet, and I'm a little bit hungry, etc., etc. But if I were in the dog situation and I still had all my rational faculties, I would know, the antifreeze is going to kill me. And I would not be willing that if I were the dog, that I would lick the antifreeze. The dog might be willing it. And I, as the human, it doesn't really affect me. But if I were this hypothetical third person who is imagining the dog's needs, who knows the situation on the ground, I would probably not be willing for it to happen. So with Gensler's golden rule, you're kind of melding yourself and the other person. This is why imagination is really important. But it does mean that it's not always about, or ideally, it's not always about what you want, as we saw in the first example of the deaf brother, and it's also not about what the other person wants, as we saw in the example of the antifreeze. So what are your thoughts on this additional criterion? I think it's pretty good, but it still doesn't get you all the way to a functional theory.
I think, well, the first thing that came to mind when you brought up the dog example is that the kita from the other example wasn't being fully employed. Well, regardless of what the dog wants, the dog isn't knowledgeable about how the antifreeze is going to hurt him. So that might be the declenching factor that that encourages him to lick from the antifreeze pool. I think with this stipulation on the golden rule, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to employ, because putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is easy enough. It's difficult, but it's easy enough. The hard work really comes in when it comes to navigating your wants and needs, the wants and needs of the other person in the situation, and harmonizing them so that you can come to a consensus that benefits all parties involved. And I think in the case of the dog situation, that just means, sorry dog, you don't get to drink antifreeze. We'll go get you a banana or some.
Dogs eat bananas?
I don't know.
Dang.
I have no clue, man. I have not had a dog ever in my entire life.
Never had one either.
But the moral of the story is, I think that I really do believe that the golden rule is something that everybody should be employing.
Right.
But I think you've made it clear. Yes. Exactly. You've made it clear that there needs to be other things that are grounding these decision-making or affecting our use of the golden rule for it to be consistent and for it to be a logical framework for us to work under.
Yes. And this really gets at what I think the golden rule kind of serves as. You can make it more philosophically sound or logically sound or whatever, as Gensler does, with the addition of these stipulations. But there's one thing that Gensler admits that I'll get into. And, my entire point is the golden rule is really good, it's really useful, and it's a really good way of looking at consistency, which I think is foundational to ethics, and also to imagination, which isn't really foundational to ethics, but is foundational in actually applying ethics in your day-to-day life. Human beings are fickle creatures, you and I included, and we're only motivated by emotion. And the only way we can really get emotional about an ethical situation is through imagining it, is through imagining the pain or imagining the pleasure and the good things that come about a certain action. We can't just say, well, I've calculated that this action will add 23 units of pleasure to the world, but this one will only add 21 units. Therefore, I'm gonna do action B instead of action. Like no one's motivated by that realistically. So that's why imagination is actually kind of crucial.
Right.
So with the golden rule, so what Gensler admits, even with his philosophically updated version, this doesn't actually tell us what to do in a lot of cases. Gensler, for example, uses the applied example of abortion. And this isn't an abortion podcast or an abortion episode, but what I will say is, Gensler uses abortion or uses the golden rule argument to say, if you were the unborn baby, if you were the fetus, you probably wouldn't be willing to die, just as you probably aren't willing to die now. I don't know if Gensler is fully applying his own situation clause because, an unborn baby has different needs and very different wants because, maybe perhaps almost there's an absence of wants, which would result in a pretty different calculus about, what I would want if I was the unborn baby, right? But it does show you, there's no straightforward answer that the golden rule does provide, and it's still dependent a lot on your values that you're bringing and your ideology or whatever that you're bringing in from outside the golden rule. But regardless, even if you don't adopt Gensler's more philosophically sound version, even if you just take the sentence as is, do unto others as you would want others to do unto you, even if you take that as is, it still serves as a really nice heuristic, a really nice shortcut path of thinking that you can remember easily, and that you can apply in a lot of situations and probably do a lot more good than you would otherwise. So I think the golden rule is really valuable in that sense.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the case that you have made is reason enough for the general public who is listening to this to agree to it as well. But I also want to say that you don't have to agree with anything that Daniel and I are saying.
No, you don't. No.
Covered this last time.
We're kind of loving the golden rule right now, but maybe there's another thing that you hate about it. And
exactly.
That's perfectly all right. One thing that we need to do is we need to go deeper, certainly. And we need to start discussing about, what is actually valuable and, what actually, matters beyond just this nice heuristic of the golden rule. Which gets us to two competing ways of seeing morality and seeing the world, which is consequentialism and non-consequentialism. And we're going to be talking about non-consequentialism first. And these are obviously phrases you may have heard before. So these are really big giants in the field of ethics. And the primary difference between the two is with consequentialism,
You agree?
we talk about non-consequentialism first.
Lied.
With consequentialism, what is actually valuable, what ends up mattering after a moral action is the consequences of it. When you are saving the dog from the antifreeze, it doesn't matter whether you're motivated by money or whatever your internal motivations are. It doesn't matter whether you're a good person. What consequentialists care about is, what actually happens to the beings involved in the situation. So if you see a dog about to lick antifreeze off the ground, if you don't save the dog and the dog dies a painful death, that's pretty negative consequences. That's a worse universe. Just imagine it on a universal, like, multiverse level. That's a worse universe outcome that exists compared to the alternative, where you do save the dog from the antifreeze. Maybe you give it like a banana afterwards, as you said, and then the dog is pretty happy and it doesn't die from the antifreeze. And
yeah, bro.
Universe B is a lot better than Universe A, but you might also be, Hitler, which was Hitler's were like pretty famously kind of good to animals and kind of kind to animals. So you might not be a good person, but in that individual act, the consequences were pretty good, and there's really nothing else that is of major importance for consequentialists. And then there's non-consequentialists, and they have obviously a lot of popular approaches, and there's a lot of ways of going about ethics without being consequentialist. But the most common way is a pluralist, goods-based method, and this might not mean anything to you, but basically what it's saying is, what is valuable is a bunch of basic tenets or a bunch of basic goods. As we discussed earlier that we want good to be something basic that we can't distill further, etc. So non-consequentialists, whether through an intuitionist way or some other way, have discovered these basic goods that everyone must follow. One version of this that a lot of people are going to be familiar with is the 10 Commandments in the Bible. I cannot name all 10, unfortunately, but I can name 2 of them, at least: don't kill, don't steal. And these are an example kind of basic goods. They're fundamental tenets that are simple, that apply to everyone, and that should make you a good person. So this is a model that has kind of developed. There's a lot of disagreement, but basically non-consequentialists that are Rothstein pluralists that believe in a basic goods model, basically they make a list of goods that are fundamental. So usually this ends up being something like benevolence, be kind to others, consistency, don't be inconsistent, kind of like the intuitionist method we discussed earlier. People will often put in stuff like honesty and justice. I think justice is a very nebulous concept, but I believe there's at least one list of goods that does include justice on it. G.E. Moore, I believe his name, is an example of a philosopher that would include one more thing on it. I'm not like fully up to date on my theory here, but he cares about aesthetic as well. So for Moore, a universe that is less beautiful, Universe A, is objectively worse than a Universe B that is more beautiful. So aesthetic could also be a basic good. And on top of goods, so basic goods can be like justice, harmony, etc. There's also duties, basic duties, or fundamental duties, or whatever you want to call them. And pluralists, type of non-consequentialists, believe in multiple duties that are fundamental that apply to everyone. And duties are, of course, associated with goods, right? For example, if one of the basic goods is honesty, then that implies a fundamental duty not to lie.
Right.
So the benefits of the the benefits of the goods model, the Rothstein pluralist model, is you can be pretty smart about which goods you pick. You can have this like fundamental base layer that you won't ever cross or you won't ever break. And it's pretty easy to say that as long as you follow that, you're a good person. And it's pretty clear and concrete in that sense. So tell me, what do you think about this basic goods model, this Rothstein model?
I think I really agree, and I know we're developing towards natural law at some point, but I agree with the connections between this and a natural law theory, that there are inherent truths or duties or actions that you can base your framework on that you'll never break that can identify whether or not you're acting in a good way. And I think the thing I like about non-consequentialism, even though you haven't fully developed that idea yet, is that what's good to me and what's good action to you, Daniel, could be two very fundamentally different things. Right. But the actions that we take up to the consequences are the part that's important. So it's like, if I value learning and I send my kids to a bilingual program because I think learning two languages is super important, then that is fundamentally good for me. If you value arithmetic over language learning and you send your kid to a STEM school for elementary, junior high, whatever, that's also good, because they're both getting to the consequence of creating a productive member of society that's going to graduate the public school division. And I think that is awesome. But the problem that I see with non-consequentialism is that the consequences aren't what's important. So let's say I hypothetically decide to go on a bike ride and I'm inebriated. I slam through an intersection that's a four-way stop and two cars get into a crash. Well, I was acting amorally or immorally taking that bike ride. So right. Yes, I'm in the wrong. But let's say I wasn't acting immorally and the alcohol wasn't involved and I was just on a bike ride and I made a mistake. Those cars still crashed. Is that my fault? Because the consequences don't matter. So I think there's a lot more discussion here to be had.
I think with the bike crash situation, I think from a non-consequentialist perspective, I think it'll be a fairly clear-cut case. One really important thing is you got to be honest, right? And everyone knows that you can't drive drunk. Everyone knows that if you're biking on the road, you're gonna make a lot of mistakes. It's probably pretty dishonest. Like, you're probably being dishonest to yourself if you say, I can drive a bike while inebriated and there's right. not going to be any problems.
Right.
From a non-consequentialist perspective, yeah, pretty straightforward. If you're a consequentialist, though, there's an extra hurdle you have to go through. But we'll go through that later when we get into that part of the episode for sure. One thing that does end up happening, and this is something that we discussed in the previous episode under the intuitionism section of that, is you do need some way of having disagreement between basic goods. One thing that Ross does is he has goods that are more fundamental than others. Like, for example, benevolence, the idea that you should be good to others, is obviously more fundamental than something like justice, or something like, I don't know, telling the truth maybe. Because obviously there's situations, Immanuel Kant might not agree with this, but obviously there's situations where you need to lie in order to result in a good outcome. Or maybe not a good outcome, but,
a more favorable one.
To satisfy a more basic good, or to satisfy something more fundamental than being honest all the time. And obviously, again, Immanuel Kant might not agree with this, but I think a lot of people, philosopher or not, would agree that being good all the time is, in a naive position. You can't, or not being good, being honest all the time is a naive position. You can't just always tell the truth and have it turn out well. But, non-consequentialists, other than Immanuel Kant, but do get around this pretty easily by just having a more fundamental system of basic goods, where helping others is probably more important than being honest, etc., etc., etc. So for whatever list you end up making as a Rossian pluralist with a goods-based method of thinking, whatever list you end up making, you can make it a pretty good, pretty rational list. And you probably end up, a fairly good person from the non-consequentialist approach. Sidgwick also kind of thinks in the same way as some of these goods-based approaches. He does have his fundamental good, which is the benevolence thing, and his criteria for finding good and for approaching good, except he takes that and uses it to justify a utilitarian, aka a consequentialist way of thinking about the world. But you can see there's a lot of similarities between the different approaches. And one thing that, you know, a lot of goods theorists, what Immanuel Kant in his categorical imperative, doesn't really matter. We aren't learning about Immanuel Kant, but what, you know, non-consequentialists like Ross with his goods list, Immanuel Kant with his categorical imperative, and natural law theorists, what they will often say is, you know, consistency is pretty important. And I think, you know, that's something we can all agree with here.